All right. Hello, and welcome to this episode 11 of our Science Saturday series. This is going to be our last episode of the spring 2022 semester. And today I'm very delighted to welcome a world-renowned expert on predatory behavior of birds, Dr. Brian Peer. He is a colleague from Western. He works in the Department of Biological Sciences and has been there since 2005. So just kind of as an introductory comment from my side for today's episode, we humans learn about our world by observing it and then using the scientific understanding to develop new technologies. And birds, of course, are fascinating in that regard. We learn the concepts of flight from birds. And something that is very dear to me, very exciting for me personally, is how the birds navigate. They carry this amazing feat of migration. And it turns out that they may be using quantum physics to attain this amazing feat. And of course, there is then a lot to learn from them by observing them and by learning about their behaviors. So to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Peer, like I mentioned, he is professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, has been here since 2005. He is a winner of many awards, the College Award for Excellence in Teaching, College of Arts and Sciences, College Award for Excellence in Research, and Provost Excellence in Research Awards. He's fellow of the American Ornithological Society. He has more than 65 peer-reviewed publications, and he's a behavioral ecologist and ornithologist whose area of expertise is the co-evolution between obligate avian brood parasites and their hosts. And you will learn about all of those technical terms very soon. So Dr. Peer, please, the meeting is yours.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kapale. Let me share my screen. It looks like I am. Okay, so today it's great to be here, first of all. I'm glad you guys got up in time to listen about birds. And I'm going to cover a variety of topics, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on any of those, but there's a few things that I want to kind of hit on that really fascinate me, and also things that I think other people are interested in birds for. And so that'll be the first thing. Why do people like birds? When I was a student and certainly, a teenager, I had absolutely no interest in birds whatsoever. And obviously my life is now devoted to them. So something happened to me along the way. Talk about what is a bird, their physiology, including their brains. We know a lot about bird brains now that we didn't appreciate before. And then migration. This is happening right now. This is a really exciting time of the year for me and other ornithologists, as well as just the amateur bird watchers. And then we'll talk about breeding, including alternative breeding tactics. And this is my specialty, my area that our field season will begin next week, immediately just as the semester ends. Okay, so why do people like birds? What is so appealing about birds? They're a constant part of our lives more than any other animal. And what I mean by that is that, take, for example, for me, when I get up in the morning, I make some coffee, I look out my back window. That is always the first thing that I do because I have bird feeders there. And I look to see what species of birds are there today. This time of the year, I have all sorts of amazing things happening. When I get in my car and I drive to work, I look for the numbers of different, species of birds that I see. Same thing happens when I take my students out for an ornithology lab. And I point out to them, well, today we saw 30 or 40 different species of birds. How many species of mammals did we see? Well, we're lucky if we saw maybe a squirrel, or, some people get excited if they see a deer. Well, that's probably 2, but the number of birds out there are much more impressive than certainly any other group of vertebrates. So in the world, there's more than 10,000 species of birds. In Illinois alone, we have more than 400 species. This is a poster in my office, and it's all the birds of North America. So there are more than 700 species, and most people are unaware of this diversity. And certainly this was the case for me when I was a student, all the way up through my start as a graduate student at the University of Illinois. My advisor was a mammologist. And that's why I went to Illinois to study small mammal populations. He forced me, and I'm not exaggerating, he forced me to take a class in ornithology. I told him, I don't like birds. I don't find them interesting. And I think people that like birds are kind of strange. Well, obviously something happened. And what it was is that I realized that all these birds are out there. That, we took it, class started in January, just like this semester, it was spring semester. And then this time of the year, I was like, oh my gosh, all these birds that we learned, we had these cassette tapes and you had to learn the songs. And they were out there. And I never realized this before. And I think that's true of most people, certainly the students in my class. They say the same thing. They weren't aware of the diversity of all these birds. So why are they, what do people find appealing about them? They're very easy to study. This is another thing that I like about them, because they're diurnal. They're active in the day. Again, if you want to think about mammals, most mammals are active at night, and that's a little bit more difficult and challenging for us to study. They're terrestrial, so they're around the ground on the earth. We're not having to go into the water and study fish or something like that. Like I said, I can look out my windows and see them, and they're cosmopolitan. This means that we can find them in the most coldest locations, inhospitable locations on the planet, like Antarctica, and the penguins there, the male penguins that care for their young, and also in the hottest deserts of the world. You can't say that certainly about reptiles and amphibians and things like that. And very few mammals are going to occupy that range of habitat. So people's fascination, this includes ornithologists, but also amateur bird watchers for birds, really kind of revolve around three things: that they fly, and that's linked to the fact that they're diurnal. So they're active in the day, but they can escape from predators. That's why most mammals are active at night. That way they can avoid being attacked and eaten by predators. They sing. This is really important because each bird has a characteristic song, and that allows us to identify them. And so as a result, we have very accurate estimates of their population sizes. In fact, today is the Illinois Breeding Bird Survey, where people are out counting the number of birds that they see based on songs or if they see them. And so we have better estimates of bird populations than certainly any other vertebrate species, due to the fact that they just announce themselves. Once they arrive during the spring and summer to breed, the males are saying, here I am, this is my territory, and then we can come up with population estimates. They're also vibrantly colored and aesthetically pleasing, dare I say beautiful. This is a bird that showed up at my feeder last week. It has absolutely no business being in Scott County, Iowa, where I live, because this bird belongs in Texas. In fact, I hadn't seen one of these. It's called a painted bunting. I hadn't seen one of these since I was doing my PhD fieldwork in Texas 20 some years ago. But this handsome guy got lost, and he kind of overextended his range. So Dr. Kapale mentioned quantum physics. I guess that he made a miscalculation, probably like I would, trying to figure out quantum physics, and ended up in my backyard, and it brought me a lot of joy for 4 or 5 days. I haven't seen him actually since Sunday. And this, to me, I would be hard pressed to find another organism that would be this beautiful. In fact, I showed this picture to my oldest daughter, and she said, it almost looks like it's fake. It's just so brightly colored. Birds are very important in terms of indicators of environmental decline. In fact, I would say they are the best indicators. Now, my colleague, our former herpetologist, Mike Romano, would argue with me because he's biased and he likes frogs and toads and salamanders. And he said, no, Brian, it's the amphibians because they have permeable skin. So they're going to be much more sensitive. And I said, well, yes, Mike, that's true. but you don't have armies of like toad watchers or salamander watchers or frog watchers out there. We have armies of amateur ornithologists and bird watchers that alert us as soon as anything goes wrong with birds because they're passionate about them. They have bird feeders. And this is what led to Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, warning us of the dangers of pesticides like DDT. There was a neighbor lady of hers that was a bird watcher, and she noticed that after the mosquito trucks came through and sprayed that, and they were spraying DDT, that the birds would start to act funny and some of them would just drop dead. Now, Carson was a marine biologist by training, so she was not an ornithologist, but she started to investigate the haphazard use of these chemicals and the dangers that they posed. So this really was the start of the modern environmental movement. And birds were also among the first indicators of climate change. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes because of the global warming and the changes in their arrival times. More people participate in bird watching and bird feeding than any other hobby. More than 45 million people alone in the United States, and they spend a lot of money. More than 4 billion is spent on food each year. Almost 2 billion spent on equipment. So if you're a young, ambitious entrepreneur and you want to make a lot of money, this might be a good option. Set up a bird shop and sell it to these crazy fanatics like is pictured here. This is a movie called The Big Year. And it illustrates, I think, very nicely the fanaticism of some bird watchers. It was based on a true story in a book, and I have that book in my office, about these individuals that tried to break the record for the most number of birds seen in a calendar year. So this is Steve Martin. The younger generation will recognize Jack Black, and I can't remember who this guy's name is, Owen somebody or other. It has a lot of bird information, plus they play on the human side of it, but it really kind of shows you that the passion that people have for birds, and we as professional ornithologists benefit from them because they can accurately identify birds and they give us information on where birds are and what they are doing. This is a story that came out last year, and it was after the pandemic. And during the pandemic, as somebody had mentioned, the value of these webinars and these Zoom meetings. People got more in touch with nature. They started to appreciate the natural world around them. And from my perspective, that's great because I've always done that. And birds give me this kind of sense of well-being. There's really no place I'd rather be than out in the field, and oftentimes by myself, just appreciating birds and appreciating nature. So you can see that the title of this article, New Study Finds Birds Give People as Much Happiness as Money. Now, that might be a bit of an exaggeration because if Western Illinois University decides to stop paying me or pay me less, I'm probably going to find a new job because I have bills to pay and a family to raise. But the point is well taken, because it does provide me with a lot of happiness and joy, like I showed you with that painted bunting. Those little things matter, and it's great to see people appreciating birds for this. Okay, so let's talk about birds, what they are. I imagine that everybody here has a sense of what a bird is, and we know what a bird is because they have a very homogeneous body plan. What I mean by that is they look pretty much the same. They have these same characteristics. They have limbs modified for flight. So in other words, they have wings. They have feathers. Those feathers are used for flight in the case of the hummingbird, or in the case of this ostrich, probably for thermoregulation and sending signals. Ostriches obviously are not flying because they're very heavy. They also have bills. They don't have teeth in those bills. So think about other groups of organisms like mammals and reptiles. I like to pick on those groups. So mammals, think about their body plans. You have like us, humans, you have chimpanzees, you have some monkeys with long tails, but then you have a giraffe, a long neck, a hippopotamus, sea mammals. Then you have elephants with long proboscis and things like that, a very heterogeneous body plan. Reptiles, you have snakes, lizards, turtles, very heterogeneous body plans. But for birds, it's all, for the most part, about flight. And so as a result, they have to have this very similar body plan. And they range in size from the smallest bird, which is the bee hummingbird. This bird is half the size of our ruby-throated hummingbird, which is about 4 grams. So you can find these guys in the southern hemisphere. And then, of course, the heaviest birds are the ratites, including the ostriches that lost their ability to fly long ago. Now, the one thing that is plastic or changeable or differs in birds are their bills. And if you show me a bird bill, I can tell you what it does for a living, or in other words, how it is securing its food, because this is the one thing that changes very rapidly in them. So over here, this is a raptorial type bill. This is an eagle that's going to tear flesh. Herons are going to spear fish. This is a cardinal. I'm sure you're all familiar with cardinals. Those bills are largely adapted for cracking seeds. The shoveler, long kind of flattened out bill with a series of lamella to filter feed. And then the crossbill, you see that and you think, oh, this poor bird has some sort of a deformed bill. Well, probably initially it was, but they've utilized that to feed on cones of pine trees. And they're very restricted in terms of their foraging, but they've used that adaptation to specialize on that type of food. Then you have shorebirds, long probing bills for sticking those in mud and sandy surfaces, maybe along a beach. Then you have the toucan, adapted for eating fruit. Here are the hummingbirds. Those are adapted for probing into flowers to get nectar. And then one of my favorite birds, this is a black skimmer. And you note, again, you think, oh, this bird has some sort of deformed bill because the top part, the mandible there, is shorter than the lower part. But it sticks this in the water and it flies over the surface of the water with that in the water. And as soon as it feels something like a fish, it'll snap it up. So again, probably something that started as a mutation, and this lower mandible got a little bit longer than the upper mandible. They've exploited that to evolve and specialize on a specific type of food item. Everything in birds is about flight, so they have fewer bones, and they also have hollow bones, or many of them have hollow bones. And you can see that here in this leg bone of this bird. So not only are they hollow, but they're air sacs. They have a series of about 9 air sacs that extend from the lungs. They extend into some of those bones to further lighten the body weight of the bird to make it easier to get around and fly. Now, there are some exceptions. Penguins, are swimming after fish, so it wouldn't be very advantageous to have solid bones. And then this picture here, I like this because it illustrates the differences in these ducks, and you can see how they sit kind of above the surface of the water, whereas this bird, it's called a cormorant. Cormorants don't have the same sort of hollow bones as the ducks do. They also have not as much oil in their feathers. And the reason for that is that they're chasing fish all day long. So if they had hollow bones, if they had oil, which doesn't mix with water, they'd be sticking up on the surface of the water, kind of like a bobber. If you ever go fishing, that thing always comes to the top. That's not going to work very well if you're a bird that's chasing after fish. So most birds are going to have the hollow bones. A few other skeletal adaptations. The wishbone, ornithologists, scientists, we call that the furcula. So you guys know, of course, that it's going to grant your wish. Maybe after Thanksgiving and you've eaten your turkey and you get the bigger side, your wish is going to come true. This is what it looks like on a bird. And that's really important because it helps to propel the wings back up during the upstroke of flight. And it also helps to protect the organs here inside of the thoracic cavity. The muscle that pulls the wings down, those are the muscles that pectoralis that you're going to eat, like if you have a chicken breast or a turkey breast. But the muscles that help to move the wings back up are super tiny. So this furcula or wishbone helps to propel the wings back up. And speaking of the pectoralis muscle, flying birds have a well-developed projection that comes straight off of their breastbone or sternum. It's called a keel. And similar to the bill, if you show me the keel of a bird, I can tell you how well it flies, because that's going to be related to the size of their pectoralis muscle and how much they fly. So this bird here, it's going to be a good flyer because there's going to be a lot of surface area for a large pectoralis to attach. If you cook chicken and you get the chicken breast at the grocery store, that kind of annoying thing there in the middle, that's what you're dealing with. It's probably some remnants of the keel. Another weight-saving mechanism is the fact they don't have teeth. No modern birds have teeth. And some of the earliest forms of birds, like Archaeopteryx, a very famous fossil, they did have teeth. The problem is if you have teeth, that means your head is going to be heavy and you're going to be top heavy. It's going to make you kind of do a nosedive into the earth. We don't want that. So they've gotten rid of the teeth and instead they have a gizzard. And this is kind of like the avian equivalent of our molars. The birds don't really chew the food. They just swallow it. It goes here into the gizzard. In fact, if you look closely, you can see some seeds in there, and that's going to grind up their food stuff. It's also centralized, that weight. So they can keep that weight centralized there, and it's easier to fly. Huge physiological adaptation for flight is the fact that they lay eggs. They're oviparous. And I appreciate this because this is what I really look for and study. I study breeding birds. And you can imagine if you're a female bird and a duck, a duck might lay 8 to 12 eggs, or a female Canada goose. They have a hard enough time getting up in the air. But if they're carrying 8 to 12 developing embryos inside of their bodies, that's going to create a lot of stress and pressure. So instead, they deposit those eggs outside. And you can see the size differences from a hummingbird. This is an extinct elephant bird egg. And the thing that really fascinates me are colors. Why do they have all these different colors? And there's a variety of reasons for that. Female birds have taken this to an extreme. They only have, for the most part, a single left ovary and a single functional oviduct. Instead of having two and having that insurance policy just in case one stops working, and the importance of reproduction, of course, is huge, but they've kind of sacrificed that for reducing the overall weight. Now, interestingly, males don't do that. They have both of their testes are operational. Birds also don't have a urinary bladder to reduce weight. Again, it makes sense. If you're drinking a lot of water, your body tends to get weighted down, but for us mammals, that's really not an issue. But for the birds flying around, that's going to be a huge problem. They have very high metabolic rates and body temperatures. So they're much more prone to overheating than we are, because they kind of push the limits in terms of how high your body temperature can get before the proteins start to break down and denature. They have the most efficient respiratory system in the vertebrates, and they need this in order to fly. In mammals, our respiratory system is highly inefficient because we have this mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated air. But for the most part, we get away with it just fine because we're not trying to fly other than things like bats. So for a bird, a single breath of air, for it to go through the respiratory system, it takes 4 movements. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out to get it all the way through the respiratory system. So I mentioned the air sacs. That first breath of air is going to go through the kind of the primary bronchus, through the trachea down to the posterior air sacs. That's breath number 1. You breathe out, it's going to go into the lungs. Then you take that next breath in, it's going to go to the anterior air sacs. And then finally, that second exhalation is going to move the air out. So this allows for the delivery of purely oxygenated air. And then, of course, the removal of the carbon dioxide waste product, which is just as important, which allows birds to do the amazing things that they do in terms of flight and migration, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Bird brains. If somebody calls you a bird brain, maybe they're trying to make fun of you, one of your friends, but really you, after hearing my talk, you're going to know that they're complimenting you, because we know that birds are actually more intelligent than most mammals. Things like African gray parrots can use and comprehend English. They can use English to describe novel situations. They can outperform apes and chimpanzees in problem solving. We used to think that birds are not very smart because their brains are so small, but in reality, within the past decade, we've learned that they pack in more neurons into a smaller space. And I'm going to show you this video. And it's going to be a bird called a New Caledonian crow, pictured here. So it's related to our American crows. And there's a treat in this tube with water. And so the bird had to figure out a way to get it because it can't reach in with its bill. So it grabs these stones to displace the water column to move it up in order to grab the treat. And he or she tries to reach it, still hasn't had enough displacement. Adds another stone. Still not enough water displacement to get the treat. And this third stone should do the trick here. There it is. It's got the treat. So I'm not going to show you all these. I'm going to show you one more here. So this one, it has the option of using heavy objects, which will sink to the bottom. And again, the idea is to move the treat up the water column versus light objects that would just float on top. Now watch this next one. It immediately discards that because it feels it's too light to displace the water. And that did the trick. Okay, I think you get the idea there. Lots of other experiments, how they make tools, similar sorts of things. It's amazing what these birds can do. You can see the same sort of thing in birds around here. So like blue jays, if you put out peanuts in shells, and sometimes there won't be peanuts inside of the shell, and they'll just discard them and they'll opt for the ones that are heavier. Can you see my screen again there just to make sure that we transitioned my PowerPoint? Yes, no. Let's try this again. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully you saw, did you see the videos? Please tell me you saw the videos. Okay, good.
Yes, yeah, we saw the videos.
Okay.
There were just a little glitch here after you came back to the slides.
Okay, okay. Yeah, everybody was paused there. I wasn't sure what was going on. Okay. All right, so I mentioned small brains. So think about the hummingbird. This is our ruby-throated hummingbird, which is 4 grams. Its brain is about the size of a single grain of rice. And we think they possibly can't be that intelligent. But recent studies have shown that they remember the location of specific flowers because that's what they need. They need nectar. That's why they're starting to show up now. They can also remember the last time that they visited those flowers. And this is called episodic memory. So prior to this study being done about 10 years ago, they were completely unaware that animals like birds had episodic memory. We thought that this was just exclusive to humans. I think there's a lot of that. We think that humans are so much smarter and better than all these other organisms, but in reality, these other organisms, and especially birds, can do many of the same sort of things that we can. Another really interesting thing when it comes to birds and bird brains is their ability to sleep with one eye open. And this is called unihemispheric sleep. So when you see a bird and their head is kind of tucked down around their wing, and I like this picture here of this duck, you can see it still has one eye open. And this is called unihemispheric sleep. It's because they shut down one side of their brain at a time, and then the other side is going to be asleep, just like we experience sleep. So this allows them to be vigilant because unlike us that, where we sleep in a nice climate controlled home with a nice comfortable bed, we don't have to worry about predators sneaking up on us. The birds out there in nature have to. And so then they'll switch off the different sides of their brains, but they're constantly being vigilant. There are also a number of birds, and I'll mention these in a minute, that are sleeping at the same time they are flying. And they're able to do this because they shut down one side of their brain. Now, I don't know how well they are flying. We don't know that. Maybe they're in kind of a cruise control mode like we are going down the interstate. But they are able to do this because there are some species that rarely, if ever, stop flying. Bird vision is well beyond our vision. This is something that has really transformed my own research because I look at how birds see eggs in particular. And when I first started this back in the 90s, we just kind of assumed, oh, they see these colors the same way that we do, and that's how we assess the colors. Now we use spectrophotometers to measure the frequencies of light that they see because they see it very differently. This is human vision over here, and you can see the different peaks of color. Probably most of you can see color better than I do because I am red-green colorblind. So I believe this is red. My vision in this spectrum is not so great. Birds can see beyond that, and certainly better than me. So you can see it's similar. But then they have this peak over here between about 300 to 400 nanometers. That's the ultraviolet vision that birds can see in some insects as well. So they're seeing the world completely different than we do. Over here on the left, you can see what we see in terms of a flower. It's a common flower that many of us have growing right now. This is a bird called a myna. This is the way we see the myna. But look at the way the bird sees the flower and the way that the bird sees other mynas. It's very different. So the flowers here, they're trying to attract the birds into the nectar. That's their reward. But at the same time, they're going to pollinate the flowers. The flowers are manipulating the birds. And of course, they see each other very differently because they have this degree of ultraviolet reflectance we can't detect. The eggs that I study, they do the same sort of thing. So one of my graduate students a few years ago, we blocked ultraviolet reflectance of some eggs. And we did this simply by using sunscreen. And then we would measure to make sure that it was effectively blocked and that worked. And so for some of the birds, they would remove those eggs if we blocked that ultraviolet reflectance. But we could never tell the difference because the eggs always look the same to us. Okay, so this really is the topic of the week and probably the month, bird migration. So this is what Dr. Kapale mentioned, the ability for these birds to figure out where to go on these long trips. And I have dueling figures here, so just bear with me. Both of these are the result of these amateur bird watchers, in addition to professional ornithologists, tracking where birds go and when they go. So each one of these numbers here on the left represents an individual bird species. So that's December 31st. And you can see how they change over time. January 1st, look where most of our bird species are, Central America, South America. And then March, you start to get this slow movement. And then we're going to hit May, where we are now. Boom, this explosion of birds. They're going to hang out here for most of the summer. And then once the fall, usually when we start the semester, they're going to decide, okay, that's enough. And they're going to head back down. And so for 8 to 9 months out of the year, this is where they are in Central and South America. They only come up here to exploit the food resources and of course to breed. So we have all this. And like I said, each one of those numbers represents a specific species because of people reporting these results through this thing on the internet called eBird. And then over here, this is one particular species called a magnolia warbler. I have not seen a magnolia yet, but I should any time now. I'm going to start here from the beginning. This is the fall. So here they are in the fall. They're kind of in the Yucatan Peninsula, northern Central America. They're just kind of hanging out there because it's nice and warm. They're probably on the beaches, relaxing, and they're still relaxing. This also gives us an illustration of how little time really what we think is our birds are here. But look what's going to happen here. We're into April, and in May, you're going to see this sudden movement there all the way through. And this is what's happening right now. And look where they're breeding. They're going to spend most of their time in the boreal forest of the northern US and also Canada. So this is really great. All these observations have helped us to kind of better understand bird migration. And as I mentioned, in terms of the environment and kind of signs of environmental degradation, for a long period of time, bird migration patterns were very consistent. So we would know, okay, this is when the average bird is going to show up here. In fact, Ed Franks is on this call. He and one of his students published a paper on the arrival times of birds and departure times of birds back in the 80s. And my students use this today, and we've seen this shift. And you can see here, other studies have found that our birds in North America arrive about 5 days earlier since the 1990s due to climate change. This shows you kind of the peak when the birds are going to show up. And right now I'm up here, you guys are right down here. So it's a late spring though. So I think this next week with temperatures forecast in the upper 80s, we're going to see a very kind of compact migration, lots and lots of birds moving through. And it's an exciting time to be an ornithologist and an amateur bird watcher. But as a result of these, the changes in the climate, not only have birds started to arrive sooner, they stay longer. Some have stopped migrating entirely, and others are migrating and expanding their ranges northward. So in some aspects, it could be beneficial to these birds if they can time up their arrival with the greening of the foliage. So some amazing migratory feats. This really shows you just how sophisticated the physiological adaptations of birds are. I'm going to go through some of the more amazing ones in my opinion. These birds are called Barheaded Geese, and you can see them there. We're not going to see any Barheaded Geese here in North America. You find them in Asia. They have the ability to fly over the Himalayas and Mount Everest, and you can see this jet here. These were the first kind of observations of birds flying over the Himalayas. There were these pilots, airline pilots, that would see these birds up there. And so we now have studied their physiology in detail, and we know that that enhanced respiratory system that I was talking about, well, they have an even better ability than the average bird to their hemoglobin to secure that oxygen they need so desperately. So you hear these stories or you watch the movies about people climbing Mount Everest and they need that supplemental oxygen. The Sherpas don't, but many of the other people that come here and pay money to do that, these birds don't. They can do that on their own because they're adapted for these extreme environments. Now, most other birds can't do that. You can see here kind of your average songbird, ducks and geese, the heights that they're going to go. They can't do that. So the Barheaded Geese are truly an exceptional species. Lots of birds, and I think this was illustrated in those figures that I showed you, are spending their time just flying almost constantly. And the Arctic tern certainly fits the bill there. I saw Arctic terns when I was in Alaska a few years ago, and this is where they're going to breed. So they spend their time circumnavigating the globe every single year. They go up here to the Arctic, they breed, they fly down here, they hang out in Tierra del Fuego, and then right about now, they're on their way back up to go ahead and breed again. Constant movement from one extreme to the other extreme. And they found that one single female flew 70,000 miles in a year. Amazing. I mean, how many of us travel that distance, maybe in a lifetime? And they're doing that in one single year. BarTailed Godwit is a type of shorebird you see pictured up there. They recorded one female flying 14 days nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand. That's 7,000 miles. Okay. Again, think about us as humans. What do we do in terms of physical activity for 2 weeks nonstop? I can't really think of anything, but that's what these birds do. They're adapted to these extremes. And it's just amazing to think about kind of the endurance that they have to have in order to make these huge migratory flights. And, I should point out the Godwit, this is not like a duck or something that can just, oh, I'm tired, I need to take a break, I'm going to land in the middle of the ocean. They're not adapted to do that. Certainly that's not the case for this bird. It's called a black-polled warbler. So we're a little bit closer to home. This is a bird that is probably starting to pass through by now. I've not seen one yet. They, on their return flight back to South America, they fly straight across the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a bird that's 12 grams. So it's probably the size of a small sparrow. So this is a 3-day flight for a sparrow-sized bird, 1,700 miles. And again, it's not adapted for hanging out in the ocean, floating around for a while. They have to do that in one swift flight. This is called a fallout. These are birds that are congregated around a lighthouse. You can't see them well, but what has happened, they've made one of these long flights across one of these bodies of water. And think about where lighthouses are located. They're usually on land, on some sort of a coastal area. So these birds, it's like somebody at the end of a cross-country race or a marathon. They just drop because they're exhausted. The birds do the same sort of thing. Okay, and you can imagine if I'm going for 3 days straight or 2 weeks straight, I gotta stop. And so these are great times for ornithologists and bird watchers to go out. You go out after the next morning, and there are just birds everywhere. And what they're doing is eating. They are famished, so they're trying to gain as much weight as possible. And that's what they do before they make these flights. They become hyperphagic. That means eat lots and lots of food. And some of them double their weight because they need that fat to burn for those long migratory flights. Then one of my favorite examples to talk about are ruby-throated hummingbirds. Again, they've shown up in my backyard, so I'm sure they're certainly around Macomb at this point. They are flying across the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a 500-mile flight there. If they're starting in Yucatan to go to New Orleans, and again, talk about a bird that is certainly not adapted for a stopover in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, they don't land a lot. They're adapted for hovering and feeding on the flowers. So they have to make these flights in one single stop. And usually what they're going to do, one single flight, they're looking for a southerly wind in the spring, because that's going to help to push them. It's the same thing for most birds. We know when kind of big movements of birds are going to happen because of those strong winds from the south. They hop on those winds. It kind of helps them. If they time this poorly, and certainly if there's a wind all of a sudden that comes out of the north, they're going to be doomed. So you can imagine that over the course of their evolutionary history, probably a number of birds, and certainly hummingbirds, didn't make that flight. So for something that small, 4 grams, to make that flight is truly stunning, is truly remarkable. One of my favorite birds in the summer, chimney swifts. These birds are never found on the ground, and it's claimed that they even mate in the air because they are never found on the ground. I don't know. They're not mating on the ground. I don't debate that, but I think they're probably mating or somewhere here associated with the nest. And you might guess where they are nesting. Chimneys, other vertical surfaces. So this is one individual that has finally landed. They glue the nest to that vertical surface, usually with some sort of sticky substance from their saliva. So if you've heard of bird's nest soup, it's the same sort of thing where people scale these cliffs to collect bird nests and people eat them. That's bird spit that they're eating. It's not something that I've ever eaten, and probably not something I'm really interested in eating. But these swifts are really common. So if you go around downtown Macomb, that's a good spot to see them. And you can hear this rapid chattering and rapid wing beats. I tell my students, look for things that look like cigars with wings. That's what they are. And they're up there collecting all sorts of insects. Well, they recorded one of these flying for 200 days straight. And again, to us, this seems pretty remarkable. And I certainly think of it as remarkable. But some people suggest that it's kind of for a bird, and some of these, you know, this flight, not those flights for, you know, across oceans. The normal flight for a bird is probably like us walking, but still, that's pretty remarkable to stay in the air that long. So people want to know, how do we study birds, and how do we know about these long migratory events? Well, for a long period of time, we would just band birds, and that means we would capture them in mist nets. So this was me several years ago, and you can see kind of this fine mesh there. One of the birds has crashed into that net. It gets tangled up because they, you know, ideally you don't want them to see the net. And then you have to extract them. And then we put a metal band around their leg. And then for some of my research, we put color bands on their legs. That way we can see a bird off in the distance with your binoculars, and maybe it has a blue band or a blue over a yellow on the right leg. And we'll know, okay, that was this bird that was banded on such and such a date. And we can observe its behavior. We can also detect whether it comes back year after year. And some of our birds are doing that. We're also using RFID tags. So these are the tags that you will use, you know, if you go to your veterinarian and the vet says, hey, you should get your dog tagged. That's what they're putting inside of your dog or your cat. Of course, you should never let your cat outside because they can do bad things to birds. That's another subject, which I'm not going to talk about. But you put these tags, then you know, or you can try to find them. So we'll put these tags on our birds as well, and because we want to know when they're coming in and out of the nest. And then more sophisticated things are called geolocators and also GPS units. This is a geolocator on the back of one of our prothonotary warblers. This it's a little bit more challenging. You put this harness over their bodies, and it's challenging because you release the bird, but then you have to recapture it and get the data. So that's a huge, because this bird's going to go down to Central America and then come back, and you're hoping it's going to come back to kind of your general vicinity. And if it doesn't come back, well, what happened? Did it perish, or did it go to a different site? And the reason why we have to use geolocators is because they're small enough in size. There's a very strict size or mass that you can put on these birds. You don't want to weigh them down too heavily. And our warblers are, 14 to 20 grams. GPS units are getting smaller and smaller. So for the larger birds, we can just put a GPS tag on it, and then you can monitor them in real time. So those are much more convenient. We don't have the ability to do that yet for our warblers. So this allows us to know where each of those birds is going. We also use radar. And this is what's happening right now. So you can see these storms, but you can see all these little blips, these kind of blow-ups. And this is happening just after the sun goes down. And for the longest time, meteorologists didn't know what was happening. They thought, oh, this is some sort of interference with our radar out there. Well, the ornithologist had to point out to them, no, those are birds coming out from each one of these little radar stations. And of course, now we know that like mayflies, when they emerge in the spring, same sort of thing, they'll cause these appearances. And so this gives us a really accurate assessment of what's going on. And I will show you this. If you are interested in birds, and this is hot right now, this thing called Birdcast, which is run through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and a variety of other different universities that you can see here. You can log on to this. All you have to do is Google Birdcast. You put in your zip code or your city, your McDonough County, for example, and I'm in Scott County, Iowa, and it'll show you these maps. So you can look at this from last night. And I will tell you, if you look at it from last night, not much activity. I think only, I don't know, I think under a couple thousand birds flew past. But they're using this radar imagery to detect when the birds are passing over. Now this is something new. It's called a migration dashboard that they started this year. And this was from last Thursday night. In my particular county, almost 2 million birds passed over. So that's a huge migration. And this here, they've got this broken down. So this is this year for migration. You can see it goes from March, and now we're into May, of course. So last Thursday was the peak migratory event so far. I am guessing that starting Saturday, Sunday into next week, we will easily surpass that. So it'll tell you the altitude that they were flying, the direction, how fast they were going, all sorts of information that we can get from this. And then they also have this, it'll tell you which sort of birds to expect, and then the peak number of birds going through. So again, I would, this is kind of cool thing to learn about what's happening at night. And I should point that out. This is when those birds are flying over. Head is at night. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second, because like I said, they have very high body temperatures. And so they're prone to overheating. So it's cooler to fly at night. It's also safer in terms of avoiding predators. So this is happening as we sleep every night. And it's exciting as an ornithologist to get up and see what's there the next morning. Okay. So I'm not going to get into a great amount of detail of this. How are they doing this? Because think about us when we're trying to go from one place to another. I still use a road atlas. I had to go, one of my daughters was moving from Florida to Kansas City, and I flew down to Florida and drove back with her. And I said, okay, Kate, let's pull out the road atlas here to figure out how we want to go around Atlanta. She's like, why are we going to do that? I'm just going to let my phone tell me. And so birds don't have road atlases. They certainly don't have GPSs, but they will use visual landmarks. So we know that, for example, my lab sits on the Mississippi River, and there's this constant movement of waterfowl. So that's kind of this convenient north-south axis that they will use. Lots of birds will kind of follow and orient along mountain ranges. They will also tell time based on the position of the sun. And if we pay close enough attention, we can do the same sort of thing. But as I mentioned, most of these small birds are migrating at night. So this is what it's going to look like. Okay, they're not going to be able to see these rivers and mountain ranges and other, things out there, visual landmarks. So we know that many of those birds will imprint on stars and even constellations to navigate. So just like they're going to imprint on mom and dad and the songs, for example, to learn how to find a mate later on in life, we know that when they're looking up at that nighttime sky in June and July, when they're sitting in that nest, they are imprinting on these stars because some researchers brought them into a planetarium and they showed them different constellations. And depending on whether it was the spring or the fall, you can switch around the orientation of the stars and those constellations. And that's the way the birds would orient themselves, because after the sun went down, they put them into these funnels. In fact, they're called inland funnels after the individual that came up with them. They put little ink pads in there, and then they could see which way the birds would start to, try to fly. And so in the spring, they were always orienting themselves north, in the fall and to the south, but then you could try to fool them based on the orientation of those stars in the planetarium, and they learned that's how they were doing that. So nowadays, in fact, there was a recent article just published, I think within the past probably 3 months, on the geomagnetic ability of birds. Birds are detecting the magnetic forces of the earth. They orient themselves along that plane, as a number of other organisms do. They also have this substance in their heads called magnetite that helps them to figure out where they go. But apparently, based on this recent study, is that there's kind of this stop mechanism that just tells them, okay, boom, this is where you land. You've gone far enough. So you think about that painted bunting that showed up in my yard. Apparently his stop mechanism did not work because he is way beyond his range. Although I think the cold temperatures that we had probably helped him to revise, and hopefully he went a little bit further south. So this is how they do it. It's very sophisticated. And again, they're not using GPS units like we are to say, okay, I need to go to such and such address. They are using these marvelous physiological abilities that they have to endure these long migrations. So why are they doing that? And this is what I study. This is what's exciting for me. It's all about breeding. And you can see some crazy song and dance routines going on here by a couple of different grebe species. These are South American grebe species. That's mom and dad out there on the dance floor. Over here, these are grebes, Western grebes that we're much more likely to see in Western North America. And you can, the birds are literally walking on the water in this kind of coordinating event, song and dance routine between them as a way to kind of size up one another, but also to make sure that you've paired up with the right species. So it's all about communication. Okay, and in my animal behavior class, we talk about communication, what it is. So when we're communicating, even as humans, we have these signals and we're trying to modify the behavior of another individual. Okay, so a signal can be a behavior, it can be a structure, it could also be a song. And a lot of times that's what the birds are using, their songs, in addition to colors, to try to manipulate other individuals. Now, these aren't all birds, but these are great examples of different signals that organisms are trying to manipulate other individuals. Fruits. Think about a fruit. Fruits are really vibrantly colored, and I'm colorblind, but that is very striking to me. The fruits are the plant's way of manipulating us to eat the fruit. You get this reward, this nice juicy substance that's going to give us energy, but the plant wants you to consume the seeds and then go out and disperse them. So it's a very different signal for something that's trying to be camouflaged and trying to avoid being eaten. These guys say, hey, here I am, I'm standing out. It's similar to this spotted skunk. The spotted skunk is really strikingly colored. In fact, it's called reverse counter shading. Most animals, if you look at them, their bellies are light in color, and then their dorsal surface is dark in color. That's because if there's a predator above looking down, well, the Earth's surface is dark, so you want to blend in. If you're looking up, you want your belly to be light because you're looking at the sun. So most organisms, think of like an orca or a killer whale, a great example of that. Something like a skunk is the exact opposite, because a skunk wants to say, hey, notice me. And that's why it's standing up here. Because if you don't notice them, you're going to run into trouble. I ran into a skunk last year in the field. I had broken my ankle, so I was already not moving fast, and I probably shouldn't have been out in the field anyways. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what a day to encounter a skunk. And thankfully, the skunk stayed far enough away from me. Their vision is not good. And I started to head the other way anyways. But they're going to, of course, spray you with that noxious substance. Like I said, this bird sings, so they're trying to send a signal. They're sending signals to other males, but also to females. This is a red-winged blackbird here as well. He has that red patch. That's a signal to other males to say, hey, buddy, stay out of my territory. This is my stuff, and this is my mate. Don't think about coming in here. Of course, the rattlesnake, if you've ever heard one of these, and I have doing my research in Texas, it's a sound that is very kind of ingrained in humans. You will stop, and you should stop, because it's a warning that don't come near me, and certainly don't try to depredate me or stand on me, because I will bite you and inject poison. This is a type of ground squirrel, and these guys have sophisticated alarm calls based on whether a predator is coming from the sky, so like a hawk or an eagle, or if there's something on the ground like a snake. So they have specific alarm calls to warn the others in their colonies. And then this is a type of antelope or a gazelle that you would find in Africa, and they do this stiff-legged jumping, and it's called stotting. There's over a dozen different hypotheses why they do this. And it's actually counterintuitive, but what they're doing, they're sending the signal to a predator, to cheetahs, and they're telling that cheetah, hey, buddy, I've spotted you. So the element of surprise is no longer there. You can't sneak up and capture me. And cheetahs almost never come after a stotting antelope or gazelle because they know it's going to be unsuccessful. So it's one of those weird situations where there's kind of this communication between a prey and a predator. Now, when it comes to breeding birds, again, think of the beauty of that painted bunny that I showed you. Usually it's going to be the males, and they're trying to show off their wares to the female. These here and here and here, these are all birds of paradise. You find these mostly in like New Guinea. And they have amazing costumes, but also song and dance routine. You can see this guy here, he's doing a dance routine. This one's hanging upside down. This is the male, and in there, that's the female. Okay, you can see how drab she is in appearance, and then you can see the peacock there. We all know those. Well, we also know that females like the most extravagant or exaggerated male birds. And what evidence do we have of that? This was a classic experiment done by a guy named Malt Anderson, where he took this bird called a long-tailed widow bird, and he cut their tails, and in some cases pasted the remnants of one male's tail onto another male's tail to look at how the females would respond. This is what the female looks like. These are the experiments here, the cut and paste experiment. This is the cool thing about birds. You can do this because it's like cutting our hair. It doesn't affect them in terms of their, sensation. You're not harming them physically or anything like that. They'll just grow the feathers back. So this is what happened before and then after. So the first group, he cut their tails in half. The second group, he captured them, let them go. The third group, he cut their tails, but then re-glued them on as a control. And then finally, from these guys in number one, those tails that he cut, he lengthened the tails of the individuals in group number 4. And this shows you the number of females they had on their territories after the experiment. And look what happened. This is the normal males, okay? But look what the females did for the males that had longer tails that were never evident in the population. They went crazy for them, showing this clear desire to be with males with these traits that have the longest tails. Why? What are you getting out of this? Why should you choose the most exaggerated long-tailed widow bird, peacock, brightly colored cardinal, or brightly colored goldfinch? It's probably good genes. And there's a couple of different explanations for this. One, it could be a resistance to disease, because we know that the brightest individual, so the brightest cardinal, the brightest goldfinch, they tend to have fewer parasites on them. One of the more intriguing ideas is called the handicap principle. This one suggests that, and it was explained specifically with the peacock. If you think about a peacock, this bird has to spend so much energy into growing all those feathers. Plus, it's going to be hard to fly and capture food. Plus, you're going to be more vulnerable to predators. The females, according to the handicap principle, like the males with the biggest handicap because they can overcome that handicap and still survive. So if I mate with that individual, those good survival genes will be passed down to my offspring. Okay, I think I'm running out of time here, so I probably better need to speed up. After they get here and they start to choose their mates, they're going to come and exploit the food. That's what it's all about. There's less competition, lots of food to eat. Catbirds. This is a common bird you find in your backyard. I like to play their song. Yeah. That is not your neighborhood cat. That is the catbird, aptly named. And you can hear these probably in your backyard. They're feeding their young 10 times an hour. A house wren feeds its young over 300 times a day. So this, I hear about these stories of people, oh, I found a baby bird in my yard and I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to feed it breakfast, lunch, and supper, just like me. Well, things don't go so well because these birds grow really rapidly and mom and dad have to spend a lot of time feeding them. This, very briefly then, this is the oldest known wild bird. Her name is Wisdom. She's an albatross, so she's a seabird. She's over 70 years old. And she is still breeding. She has flown over 3 million miles in her lifetime. And the reason why we know she is this old is that the individual who banded her did so in 1956, and that's the band on her leg. And so this guy is still alive, Chandler Robinson, and it's estimated she had to be at least 5 years old because these birds are a little bit older when they breed. So it's amazing that something that is this old continues to breed. This is very rare for organisms, but this is why they're going through these extravagant, rituals to find a mate, but also the long flights. Okay, now this is what I study. There are some birds that never care for their own young. They never build their own nests, and instead they take advantage of other birds and exploit their parental investment. These are called obligate brood parasites. There are more than 100 different species of brood parasites in the world, and probably the most famous is this one pictured here, which is the common cuckoo. If you have a cuckoo clock, I have one. That bird that comes out there and does the cuckoo, that song, that's a cuckoo, that's a brood parasite of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this is a baby cuckoo. It has just left the nest. This is its fully grown host bird that has no idea that this thing doesn't belong to it. And it is so much bigger than the mom bird. The mom bird has to climb onto its back to feed it. So this bird is very good at tricking and exploiting the parental investment on the part of the hosts. How are they able to do this? Why is it the only baby left? Well, here's that same picture, another kind of cool one where mom is now standing on the head of baby. This is the baby cuckoo after it hatches. One of the first things that it will do is to shove out the eggs of the host bird. If it feels any sort of contact, it gets its wings on opposite sides of the nest, puts its back underneath the eggs, and then shoves them over the edge of the nest. And you can see another picture here. This is the host bird watching, does not recognize what is going on. That's all of its parental investment, all of its genes literally being shoved over the edge of the nest. This is the outcome. This is what's going to be left. There's that baby so big that it's completely outside and overgrown the nest. Another one, and I'm excited about this one. This is called a honey guide because I'm going to go to Africa here finally, that the pandemic has hopefully kind of come to an end here, to study the brood parasites in Africa. There are more than 12 different species there. And this is a honey guide. This bird got its name because it guides people to beehives. We, of course, like the honey, and it gives a specific call, and then the people there give a specific call back. So it's a great example of mutualism. The birds don't want to eat the honey. The birds can digest the wax. But these birds are also parasites, and they have this nasty habit of killing the host nestlings just like the cuckoos, but they use fangs. You can see them very clearly here, clearly there. They will puncture the host eggs. They will grab hold of the hosts, shake them violently to kill them. And if you're a researcher and you stick your hand into one of the nests, they'll even clamp down onto you. Now, people think, oh my gosh, these birds are so evil and so horrible. They do these things, but they have to. If they are not able to trick the host birds into caring for their young, they would go extinct. Now, this is our brood parasite. This is what I study. Very common. I've already seen them today when I was out for my walk, and they're in my backyard. That's the brown-headed cowbird. This is the male. It's a black bird. So brown head on the black body. This is the female. This is the nest that I found in Macomb, that catbird that I showed you. It lays these blue eggs, and then you can see the egg that doesn't belong there, white with brown spots. So this has been laid by the female cowbird. They've been known to parasitize 250 different species of host birds here in North America. Now, the catbird is exceptional because it recognizes that egg and rejects it, tosses it out, and is done with it. But about 90% of our host birds here in North America raise the cowbird. And I want to show you this video that we recorded last year. This is, we have these cameras that we mount inside of the nests. This is the bird that's sleeping inside of the nest. This is the entrance hole into the nest. You can see it's dark because we recorded this at 5:16 in the morning, June 4th. And I'm going to turn up the volume. So this is a prothonotary warbler. She is sleeping on the nest, incubating the eggs. And then you're going to hear this clatter on the roof of the nest box. She immediately jumps up and leaves because chances are there's a predator. Now you can see her 2 eggs, and pay attention to that. You can hear her chipping in the background, but she's not going to come to the nest because, again, this could be a snake or a raccoon wanting to eat her. Now you watch what comes inside. This is the female cowbird. They show up before the sun comes up, and she's going to raise up and drop her egg. And she does all of this within 10 seconds. And you can see her egg right there. They've evolved this trait to lay before the sunrise because usually the hosts aren't here. This was an exception, and do it very quickly because if the host bird is there, there's a fight. And we have amazing videos of the fights. So what happened is the host bird comes back and takes care of that cowbird egg just like it was its own. And they can still raise some of their young, but they're going to raise fewer young. So that's what we're going to start doing next week. And then one last thing here, as I'll wrap this up. I can't have a bird talk without mentioning this famous bird that we discovered here in the Quad Cities about 10 years ago. This created all sorts of media uproar. It's a bilateral gynandromorph northern cardinal. So it's half male and half female. This is not a Photoshop picture. I don't know how to do Photoshop, honestly. I took this picture and I lucked out because the bird was looking right at me. This is the male side and this is the female side. We were interested in it in terms of its behavior. Is this bird going to act like a male? Is it going to have a female? Does it sing songs? Is it going to lay egg? We didn't know. And unfortunately, after 3 years of study, we couldn't find its nest. It would only show up in the winter at this individual's bird feeder. But if you remember back to your biology, the reason for this is a mistake in meiosis. So meiosis is supposed to be this reduction division where we create gametes that have half the number of chromosomes. Well, it's a mistake with mom's eggs. So she produces a normal egg, but then there's this additional thing called a polar body. And in this case, it's a little bit bigger, and it was fertilized by a separate sperm. So you had 2 sperm essentially fertilizing 2 eggs, and that's what this individual is. It's a chimera of 2 individuals, a male and a female. and it's crazy. It's crazy how it's affected my career, because now apparently I'm an expert on bilateral gynandromorph birds, but I don't think there is an expert because they're so rare in the world. So anytime there's a paper on one of these, or people think they have one in their backyard, they send me these pictures, and it's kind of exciting. It's another kind of one of the interesting things about birds. You never know what's going to show up in your backyard. And indeed, this showed up in somebody's backyard bird feeder. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, wonderful. So please unmute your microphones, and let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Pierre for this fascinating presentation on birds. It was all completely new to me. I did not know so much about birds, and it was very exciting to see how they adapt and all of the techniques that are used for studying them. I'm actually more interested in learning about them now. So I'm going to pick Dr. Brian and Pierre's brain here when we meet next time. We teach a class together, so we meet quite often. And so all very, very fascinating. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And this is going to stay in the WIU Physics channel, YouTube channel, which has a separate playlist for Science Saturday. So there will be many more people who will be able to watch this as well. So thank you for that.